Okay, all right. We're here with Dr. Joseph Wyatt, who you may call behaviorology podcasts. That was in February of 2019, interview with the forensic psychologist, where he talked about his book on some of his cases. I think it was the Breaking Point Killing, right?
That's
Is
the
the name of
title
the
of the
book?
book, The Breaking Point Killing.
Yeah,
Thank you.
very, very good book. Highly recommend it. Very good book. And so recently we had a little discussion, and this is a topic I really have wanted to talk about. The In the 1980s, the McMartin Preschool Sexual Abuse Trial, and then come to find that Dr. Wyatt had written an article about it that I never knew about. So, Joe, first of all, thank you for being on the podcast.
My pleasure, Tim.
Looks like you're having nice weather out there.
It's a beautiful June afternoon, early evening in West Virginia. Welcome to my back porch, cluttered up as it may be, but I
Uh,
decided it would be kind of nice to do this outside.
Looks better than my back porch, that's for sure. That's why I've got the background on here. So, Joe, to cut to the chase, you're as we already know, you're a forensic psychologist.
Correct?
Um, you wrote an article. I'll link it up here, but it was about the McMartin preschool case. What can you tell us about that?
Well, and thanks, Tim, for inviting me.
Hmm?
And although an especially area for me was forensic work, I have always done that from a behavioral perspective. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
behaviorist, and I have found that in all my years and working on hundreds of cases with the courts, I've found that a behavioral perspective was very beneficial because we behaviorists are interested in observation, verification, data,
Mm-hmm.
etc., rather than a lot of speculation and assumptions about what might be going on in the mysterious part of the mind and
Mm-hmm.
so on. And so, really, being behavioral was an asset in working in the courts. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the McMartin case was one of the most high-profile cases of alleged child sexual abuse in the history of America. It began in the 80s and didn't end until the 90s. And this took place in the coastal community of Manhattan Beach, California.
Mm-hmm.
It was there in the early 80s that a child in the McMartin preschool told her mother or his mother, I've forgotten which it was now, um, that it had been sexually abused in the preschool.
Mm-hmm.
This triggered interviews with dozens and dozens of children by a few well-intentioned but misguided interviewers.
Mm-hmm.
And before it was over, there were allegations by dozens of children of hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of child sexual abuse. And in the end, as this played out, a number of people went to trial in the case. The charges were dropped against all but two,
Mm-hmm.
and then those two went to trial, and there were several counts against of abuse against one of them, only one count against the other, the owner of the preschool, Peggy McMartin Bucky,
Mm-hmm.
and that count was dropped by the court. And then Raymond Bucky went to trial and was found not guilty. So in the end, after years and years of this litigation, there were no substantiated cases of child sexual abuse. Now, one of the interesting features of all of this was the allegation by some of the children that much of the abuse had taken place in secret tunnels that had been dug by the perpetrators underneath the preschool. And that was a kind of a curious complaint, because investigators looked under there and there weren't any tunnels. All there was dirt under the concrete floor of the one-story preschool. So the investigators just let that drop. And then the case played out and the people were either dismissed, the charges dismissed, or found not guilty. But many of the parents of these children, in a heightened state of emotion, and you can't blame them for that, they continued to believe their children, even though the charges were not substantiated. So the parents went out to the property and they began to dig to try to find evidence of tunnels. Well, the owner of the property said, "You got to stop that." And the preschool at this point had been shut down for years. Nobody wanted to put their child in a preschool with all these allegations.
The people in the people that worked there they were in jail for a long time.
They were in jail for a long time.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the parents, still believing that abuse had happened in tunnels, hired a professional archaeologist from one of the well-known schools in Southern California. I think it might have been UCLA, but I've forgotten. His name was Gary Stickle. He conducted, over a period of a couple of weeks, a professional archaeological dig. And when he was finished, he concluded that absolutely there had been tunnels under the preschool, but that they had been backfilled. And the parents knew that the alleged perpetrators had access to the school for about a year after the initial charges, and the parents concluded that the alleged perpetrators, the people who worked at the preschool, had taken small amounts of dirt in there, a little bit at a time, and filled in the tunnels so as to take away any suspicion. So that's where it was. And it was pretty disturbing when you have a professional archaeologist say, yes, absolutely, there's nothing that could account for what he found other than tunnels that had been backfilled. Now,
so that there was the allegation. There's been several specials on this case, and I followed up on one the other day. It's called Indictment with James Woods. It was an HBO movie about
yes,
the
that
case.
HBO movie, a well-made movie, and I would recommend it.
Yeah, it's very good, and it's kind of strange that it turned out they're supposed to be in these tunnels, because you could see the preschool with a large window, virtually everything that goes on in there from the street. And then the allegations were, well, they were in a tunnel somewhere and there was no tunnel, but then this archaeologist was brought in to do a study and see if this filled-in dirt was once an actual tunnel.
Right. So I hadn't heard much about that, but I was in a professional meeting with the staff of a local agency here in West Virginia that I was consulting with back in the late 1990s. And a staff member got to talking about the McMartin preschool case and said, "Oh, they found the tunnels."
Okay.
I thought, I never heard that. So I let it go. And then maybe a year later, I was in a continuing education program being led in front of 200 people at least. And there was a well-respected professional leading this. And at some point he said, "Oh, they found the tunnels." So during a break, I talked to him and he said, "I have the archaeology report. Would you like to see it?" And he sent it to me.
Okay.
This was about 500 pages. And, I read it, and by the time I was finished with it, I completely disagreed with the archaeologist's conclusions. And so I wrote this paper, which was published in a very nice journal. I'm going to look at the title. I forgot. Behaviorists for Social Responsibility.
Right.
And there I showed why the archaeologist really was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So to get into that, here are some of the things that when the archaeologist dug, some of the things he found. And remember, this was on a piece of property which had a house. It was two lots side by side, the preschool on one, and it was constructed in 1966. But beside it, the owner of that property had a house going back all the way to the 1920s.
Huh?
Well, and so the preschool side was a vacant lot up until 1966.
Okay.
So these people out in this rural area had lived there up through, there'd been two different owners, up through 75, when the house was eventually demolished and the preschool was built in 1966.
Mm-hmm.
So the archaeologist found in this area that he said was a backfilled tunnel, he found dirt, and he found dozens and dozens of old bottles
Mm-hmm.
and dozens of old tin cans.
Mm-hmm.
And he found an old pair of glasses, and he found animal bones, including chicken bones and hog bones, and even cattle bones.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the animal bones, the smaller ones, made you think, well, could they have sacrificed animals in satanic ritual abuse?
That was one of the allegations. They were sacrificing little
Children had
animals.
said that.
Yeah.
Children had said that. Now, um, the tunnel was only about 4 feet tall, the alleged tunnel.
Okay.
There would have been no way to get adult-sized cattle down in there. So it sounded a little strange. Moreover, further analysis showed that these bones had been cut with buzzsaws, like butchers use when bones are frozen, and then they just cut right through it to cut the steaks and such, which was also a little bit interesting. The bottles and the old tin cans were mostly manufactured in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, some in the 50s. None of them as recent as 1966, when the preschool was built.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the most recent was 1960.
Okay.
So you begin to wonder, why would the people at the preschool trying to cover their tracks go out and find dirt that had all of these old bottles and old cans, none newer than 1960?
Mm-hmm.
They found something else in there. They found the mailbox of the house, since torn down, of the property, an old rural mailbox. You see them if you drive through the country. Some in the city, they are metal with a rounded top, kind of like a barn, and a little flag you put up, an old rural mailbox, and it had on it the address of that property. So it became even more interesting and suspicious. Where would these alleged perpetrators have gone to find dirt that included all of this stuff, including that mailbox?
Mm-hmm.
And couldn't they find some cleaner dirt somewhere?
Yeah.
So now there were 3 items that were manufactured, that the archaeologists found, that were manufactured after 1966. One was a little fold top sandwich wrapper with Disney figures on it that was made in the early 80s.
Okay.
2 others were little pipe clips that a plumber would use to fix a broken pipe such as on the toilet, and it was found in an area near a wall where most likely what had happened was a plumber had dug in from the outside to fix a broken pipe to a toilet rather than taking a jackhammer and drilling down through the concrete floor of the preschool. But what about that wrapper?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a common phenomenon called bioturbation, which means a squirrel or some other rodent finds a little item and takes it underground. And that's probably how it got there. So in the end, this archaeologist found things that were only put in that ground, or that were only manufactured way before, years and years before the building of the preschool. So here is what seemed to have happened.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I said, I live in West Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not unusual for me to drive out in the country. And what you see is a home with a trash pit out back, maybe with a little curl of smoke coming up out of it, where the people throw their trash in there, their garbage in there,
Mm-hmm.
burn it to the extent they can. But what do they do when it's about full of trash? They dig another pit right beside it and throw that new dirt on top of the filled in pit.
Mm-hmm.
That one is full of trash. They repeat that. Moving over 6 feet or 3 feet, digging another pit, throwing the dirt in. And in a while, you have kind of a string over a period of years of pits, each covered with dirt. And I began to think that is what happened in that rural property back in the 1940s and 50s. And that is what the archaeologist had found and mistaken for a filled-in tunnel.
So this area, this Manhattan Beach, it could have been back in the 1920s. It was a more rural area. Over
Exactly. It
time,
was most likely quite rural without trash pickup and so on.
uh-huh. Yeah, and we don't all live in areas where they pick our trash up every week or almost every week.
And
Some of
particularly
us
back in those days.
back in the and in that time they had to make their own trash pit.
Exactly.
Okay. So where does that take us?
Well, what it set me to doing was thinking about the archaeologist and trying to at least theoretically, behaviorally analyze how he had missed something that seemed so obvious to me.
Hmm?
So, doing a theoretical behavior analysis, I began to ask myself the behavior of interest is his finding of a trash pit and mistaking it for a filled in tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
What would be some of the antecedents to that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, for one thing, and I don't know, but possibly he had never lived out in the country nor spent a lot of time out there. I just
Right.
don't know. But a second, more likely antecedent was that the parents were highly emotional. They were saying with certainty that they knew a tunnel had been under there because their children swore it. And remember, these are preschoolers, and preschoolers are highly suggestible.
Mhm.
If you give me a bunch of 3 and 4-year-old children, I could convince probably half of them that they just saw Santa Claus run through this porch and out into the yard 15 minutes ago. If you gave me a little time and space to work. And in a sad way, the well-intentioned people who interviewed the children may have created these allegations themselves by repeating their questions. Are you sure you didn't, that Raymond Bucky didn't touch your privates? Now, no. Well, maybe, Johnny said, you're the little boy that's in the preschool with, he said that he did. Maybe you forgot. And on and on and on. And finally, the child is saying, no, it didn't happen, and is crying. I mean, this is on video of the interviews way back in the 80s. And the interviewers are as much as saying, well, now you can't go home until you tell me what really happened. And many of these children cracked and said, yes, it happened. So it was astonishingly poor interviewing. And research around that time and subsequently showed what was wrong with it. But
I guess
aside
that
from
they.
that, so an antecedent was that parents were very emotional, and there
Mhm.
was this mentality, not just in the professional community, but around, in for many people, that if children said it, it must be true because children would not be sophisticated enough to lie.
Mhm.
And actually, I don't think these children were lying. I think they had come to believe that these things they were saying were true. They weren't.
And the interviewers were using anatomically adapted dolls
Yes.
to show them uh, body parts that you wouldn't see when you have your everybody has their clothes on, but and then and in demonstrating what may have happened in a sexual abuse act on these dolls.
Yes, and that that remains somewhat controversial.
Uh-huh.
I have come to the conclusion that the anatomically detailed dolls should not be used.
Mm-hmm.
There might be a use for them, but only after the abuse has been well established, such
Yeah.
as finding uh, photographic evidence of it as it happened or the like,
Yeah.
but not
Th-
when it's still trying to be established.
Yeah, those dolls, that technique is for a therapeutic technique to work with the children.
That
It's
as well.
not it's not a determination of what happened. They were never intended for that purpose.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I think the kind of this, if it's out of the mouths of babes, it must be true. You're working with an archaeologist who isn't behaviorally trained, obviously. You have very emotional parents insisting that it happened. So the stage was set with those antecedents for him to find what he found. Now, what were the consequences of his thinking and reporting that he found tunnels? Well, one would be probably the praise and lauding by the parents, saying, "Thank you, Dr. Stickle, you found it,
Mm-hmm.
and you're the person we've been looking for," and so on and so forth, and perhaps from professionals as well. So he felt he'd done a good job, and who doesn't want to feel that?
Mm-hmm.
So that was part of my behavior analysis. There was another feature to it. Skinner wrote a lot about what he called operant seeing,
Mm-hmm.
and we've all done it. You're at a party, you see someone across the room over there that you've been wanting to talk to whose back is turned, and you say, "Oh, this is my chance." And you go over and you say hello, and then you realize when you see the face, oops, that's not Jones, somebody else. So you saw Jones when Jones wasn't there. We see examples of it when, oh, it's so sad. A policeman shoots somebody who pulled out a gun, but it was a cell phone. The policeman saw a gun, but it was a cell phone. That's what's called operant seeing. It's a
Mm-hmm.
common phenomenon. So I think the archaeologist saw these items and other things I'll mention in a moment, and he saw them as evidence of abuse. Somebody else might see it as evidence of a trash pit.
Mm-hmm.
There were other things. For example, the preschool had an alarm system. So out front at the office, they had 4 classrooms. Out front at the office, somebody could push a button and ring an alarm back through the school. It didn't work very well necessarily. It's kind of out of commission most of the time, I think, but it was there. The archaeologist interpreted that as evidence of a warning system for people who were back there in tunnels or elsewhere doing abuse if a parent came in unannounced.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, the thing was totally open. Parents could come and go all the time, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
The archaeologist saw it as that. Anybody else might have seen it as an essential in case there was a fire or something,
Yeah.
an alarm, simple alarm.
Mm-hmm.
There was an open a classroom door that wouldn't shut properly.
Mm-hmm.
And the archaeologist interpreted that as, and there was a child too young for the preschool, I think just a 2-year-old. The parent would come there maybe to pick up another child. And this little 2-year-old, since the preschool was limited to 3 and 4-year-olds, I believe, this 2-year-old would run back through there through an open door and start getting into stuff. And the archaeologist more or less interpreted warnings. Oh, don't let little Jimmy run back there because he's going to get into something, might get hurt, as trying to keep little Jimmy from seeing something he shouldn't.
Yeah.
Where another person might interpret that bit of information as they didn't want Jimmy to run back there and pull an easel over on his head. So
Mm-hmm.
there were all those kinds of things. And I think the archaeologist was seeing those things as evidence of abuse or ways to hide abuse. Anybody else might see them as normal phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one other thing, and I'm going to just read it
Okay.
from the archaeologist report, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
Let me find this. There was the archaeologist hired a company to do ground penetrating radar,
Mm-hmm.
PPR. Now that is, for those who don't know, that's a type of radar that can penetrate down 8 or 10 feet into the ground and determine if there's something unusual down there. It doesn't give clear pictures like an X-ray, for example, but it does
Mm-hmm.
show if there's something disturbed about the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So the company that the archaeologist hired to help him, that company did their ground penetrating radar in various areas, including the tunnel areas. And their conclusions, I'm going to quote from their conclusions.
Okay.
They wrote, in areas 1, 2, 3, and 4, which were basically the classroom areas, some other areas, and 5, the ground penetrating radar depth of penetration was approximately 8 to 10 feet below ground level. No evidence was found to support the existence of filled-in below-ground tunnels.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Mr. Stickle, or Dr. Stickle, the archaeologist, had that report in hand
Mm-hmm.
and quoted that I just read to you in his 400-page analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But he interpreted that finding this way. To go back a page,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Stickle said in his report, thus, the ground penetrating radar was successful in determining the main tunnel at the locus of the dividing wall between the two classrooms.
Okay.
Exactly backward from what the ground penetrating radar analysis had found.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is another example of operant seeing or operant reading. He read something and saw something completely different.
Sometimes you have a journal article and they'll cite some other article as determining something, and you go find that cited article, and that's not what they said.
That does happen. It's not unusual at all. So, so those are some of my thoughts and my analysis from a behavioral perspective of the alleged tunnels, which were not tunnels at all, rather they were an old filled-in trash pit that was discovered underneath the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California.
So, uh, Stickle, the archaeologist, he certainly had a process where he was reinforced to find something. Um, and we have the phenomenon of the operant seeing things that really were just encouraged to see, or interpreting a set of facts in such a way
Exactly.
that you're encouraged to see, very much so. Well, what about the prosecutors in this case? Um,
Well,
were their eyes were they biased in their view?
oh, certainly they were. And,
Um,
you know, this case played out over years and years.
hmm
And it's so unfortunate. The I think the prosecutors, well, they should be sensitive to the demands of the public. That's part of a prosecutor's job.
hmm
But and at that time, there was not a lot known about what the ease with which young children, especially preschoolers, may be led to say things that clearly are not true.
hmm
So I'll give them that. But there came a point where prosecutors, I think, were miscarrying justice to proceed.
hmm
Um, this case was, I don't remember exactly how long it played out, but it was years and years. And it was the most expensive criminal trial, most costly in the history of California until
hmm
the O.J. Simpson case,
hmm
which topped it. But when you think about some of the disastrous outcomes, first, you have children who will grow up, many of them, believing that they were sexually abused and it never happened. By all accounts, it
hmm
never happened. So when those children are grown-ups and having relationship problems or become obsessive compulsive or depressed or whatever, what's the likelihood that they may cite unresolved inner problems from sexual abuse as at the root of this?
hmm
Possible.
Yeah.
One thing that did happen as the years played out, one of them wrote to, I think, the Los Angeles Times, a guest article saying, the abuse never happened to me. I said that it did, but I
hmm
kept getting hammered and berated by the therapist until I just felt like I couldn't go home until I admitted it. And
Right.
this person was a grown up by the time
Right.
of writing this article. Um, so I give that person a lot of credit. But so you have children, some of them probably to this day, now in their 30s, um, believing that the legal system let them down. And you have parents believing that the legal system let them down,
Yeah.
still convinced that it happened. So the legal system took some hits here, but it
Yeah.
took some in another way, I believe. This was all over the news. And in time, this HBO movie came out, which was really, really good. I don't remember the date of it, but it was, I
I think
think,
it
in the
was
90s. Pardon me?
1995, I believe, when it came out.
95.
Yeah.
So it was all over the place. And as a forensic psychologist and behavior analyst, I have worked, I'm retired now, but I worked on over 900 cases in my career. And most of them were pretty perfunctory, but I'd call about 300 of them pretty interesting. They were
hmm
everything from a few civil cases to petty crimes, auto theft, and then murder. Most of them
Mm-hmm.
murder. And so I've been in a lot of courtrooms, and I think I have a feel for how courtrooms work, how juries think, and the whole process.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe there probably have been people who were actual perpetrators of child sexual abuse, but members of juries let them go free because they had heard about the McMartin case, how it was debunked, they'd seen the movie, and said, this is just a bunch of phony baloney by prosecutors trying to make a name for themselves. So I have a
Mm-hmm.
feeling that one of the unanticipated consequences of this whole disaster was perpetrators actually being let free
Mm-hmm.
to molest children again.
Yeah. Yeah. It hurt the credibility.
And in
Uh,
fact, I had one report of just that I
mm-hmm.
kind of heard about by happenstance. So
Mm-hmm. And the McMartins lost everything,
they
right? Their
lost
preschool.
everything. Of course, they lost their preschool. They lost their good reputations. Everything. I mean, the cloud will never go away from over their heads because in a matter like this, there are people who will always say, "Well, where there's smoke, there's fire." I
Mm-hmm.
understand that, but they'll never get out from under that cloud. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
whatever happened to the people who worked there. Um, Probably, I'm quite sure that the owner, who was a grandmother at the time all this happened, is dead by now. I don't know that for a fact, but
Mm-hmm.
too many years have gone by. Should be
Yeah.
well over 100. Um, but Ray Bucky was, maybe in his 20s then. And so I imagine he's still alive, and who knows?
Um, we're kind of living in an age. It kind of reflects this of somehow a serious accusation um, is more important than the evidence. In other words, if an allegation is serious enough, well, we've got to look into this, and we got to hold someone responsible. When it ought to be the nature of the evidence is what matters. It's the rights of the. That's why we have rights of the accused, and we have this whole process.
Of course. And
Yeah.
I think, again, that's why a behavioral perspective really fits
Yeah.
well with the system of jurisprudence because all the times I was on the witness stand, I never once referenced, the inner workings of the unconscious part of the mind and all that. I was always trying to analyze things from a behavioral perspective. Not that there aren't important things going on inside us, like thoughts and feelings, but they have very little in the way of causal status from my perspective. Looking for the causes, you have to look outside the person and find out what brought a person like Gary Stickle
Mm-hmm.
to the place that he was.
Mm-hmm. One of the McMartin employees, she lost her teaching license, but successfully sued to get it back after she was after her charges were dropped. That was one of the what happened to one of them. We're living in a very interesting time. A lot of controversies abound about getting to the objective truth of something. And I suppose something like this is, if there's any lesson to it, you don't arrive at the objective truth by starting with a conclusion and then looking for things to match that conclusion. You look at what you know and let that lead you to a conclusion.
Yeah, that's a common mistake. People reach their conclusions and work backward from there to find
Uh-huh.
evidence to support it and
Uh-huh.
discount what isn't there. That's called a confirmatory bias. And I think it was probably at work with Gary Stickle, the archaeologist. Everything he saw confirmed the bias he went in with, probably, and I'm assuming he went in with, that probably the abuse happened because so many children had said it happened and the parents were so convinced and so on. You know, it puts me in mind of things we're seeing in today's world, like the QAnon conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
QAnon turns out to be two men, a father and son pair named Watkins, by the way, living in the Philippines. They're back in the States now, I think. But they described themselves as only the conduits for Mr. Q, a deeply embedded person in the government, federal government, who was telling them all these things. And I think what we know now is it was just them spewing out, spinning these tales that allegedly came from this Q person. Well, the problem is a lot of people, mainly I think people who never developed very good critical thinking skills, who weren't good at saying, what's the evidence?
Uh-huh.
Um, and analyzing whatever was said, good-hearted people who wanted nothing more than to protect children that were, they said, were being abused by a cabal of elites, uh, and so on and so forth. And that's the whole thing. But it was these two guys named Watkins, and the news has reported on them fairly extensively. It's not hard to find. And I think Q was just them. And even one of them slipped and said something in one interview I saw, which kind of made that clear. And the result has been disastrous. You know, a lot of good people misled and
Mm-hmm.
drawn into this thing and couldn't seem to get out of it. Others have got out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I believe we need to be doing a better job of teaching critical thinking skills, starting with first grade at the latest. It can be
Mm-hmm.
done. I think we have research showing it can be done. Then
Mm-hmm.
we avoid the confirmatory bias and we start asking, what's the evidence when we hear a wild claim?
Yeah, if we make an effort to do that, and if children are, we know they're suggestible, but maybe that means on a good side they could be taught critical thinking, so by the time they get older and they're in positions of responsibility, they won't be as prone to just believe something without
That
the evidence to
that's
guide
what we
them.
hope. We hope so.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to identify that problem first on a large scale basis. And up to now, that's been a bit of a problem.
I looked through Wikipedia on the McMartin trial, and about halfway down, you're mentioned, Joe. So your reach and your analysis has even jumped off of literature, and it's now in Wikipedia.
Well, maybe that'll encourage some people to think about this a little bit more. You know, there were many other cases, mostly in the 80s, where
Mm-hmm.
children, the same, it was identical kinds of things. Maplewood, New Jersey, a young preschool teacher named Kelly Michael, I think it
Mm-hmm.
was. I mean, somebody got a parent got a whiff of something, and this preschool was totally open. Parents came and went all the time. And this poor teacher was accused of all kinds of misdeeds, of putting peanut butter on the kids' genitals and licking it off and penetrating them with a sword. I mean, you'd think somebody would see that, but and it just went on and on from there. And she did years in prison before
Oh
she was
no.
completely exonerated. In the end, it was a bunch of well intentioned but misguided assessors, most of them social workers, frontline social workers, who just started talking to these children and wouldn't let them go home until they said they had been abused. I'm thinking of another case in a coastal community down in North Carolina where the same thing happened. Dozens of children ended up saying they were abused. Um, People went to prison.
Mm-hmm.
And
It was
the
a whole. It
claims
was.
of abuse were so outlandish, again in the 80s. For example, that some of the abuse had taken place on spaceships in outer space.
Uh-huh.
I mean, a child says that to a jury, the jury should say, I cannot believe anything else that child says. That's my thinking. But people were convicted with stories like that.
Well, in the McMartin case, the allegations were they were taken on a plane to Nova Scotia.
All kinds of bizarre.
Yeah.
Are you sure you weren't taken on a plane somewhere? And the questions, I mean, they just led these children to all kinds of things. I had forgotten anything about a plane in the McMartin case.
Yeah, I just it was. I suppose there was a momentum there. The kids kept being pressured to say something, so the story would get bigger and bigger. Instead of saying no, no, it didn't happen. Okay, maybe it was this. Maybe it was. I mean, maybe it was a tunnel. They went to a church somewhere, and sacrificed animals on a church. That was one of the allegations. So I just reading it, I can't believe anybody would ever believe this stuff. And much less
Mm-hmm.
that like
Yeah, there was that out of the mouths of babes, it must be true belief
yeah.
system. So there we are. I just wish that none of that had to have happened. I think if, strangely enough, I think if more of those examiners had been behaviorally trained,
Mm-hmm.
much of this wouldn't have happened. But it did.
It, is there an element where at a certain point people don't want to, they have an inkling that something is wrong, but after they've put this much effort into it, they don't want to admit they're wrong anymore?
I think that does happen. It's a human foible. We all have our own,
Uh-huh.
and we don't want to say, "Uh-oh, I blew it." Uh, we men have a particular problem with admitting that we are lost when driving somewhere in the car.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Of course, the consequences usually aren't anything worse than some wasted time and gas.
Right.
But yeah, we don't want to. I'm human. I'm like that. But life does get easier when we start to be able to comfortably say, "Oops, I blew it."
I was wrong. I turned the wrong way. Now it's time to turn back.
Exactly.
Joe, I know you have another great article. It's about B.F. Skinner, but that's another day. It's very interesting, but we hope to have you back, and we can talk about that and maybe a few other things.
Yeah, there may be people who don't know that in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the FBI kept an extensive file on B.F. Skinner because he had signed a full page article in the New York Times, along with hundreds of other luminaries opposing the Vietnam War and different reasons like that. The FBI began keeping a file on him, and I got my hands on that file
Hmm.
under the Freedom of Information Act, and I wrote an article about that, and that's what you're referring to. Perhaps we can talk about that on another day.
That is, um, it's coming. Yeah. Uh, oh, that's the wrong one. Oh, I thought I had the name of it up. I messed
I
up. Well,
think the title is The FBI File on B.F. Skinner.
that's it. Yeah, behavioral science in the crosshairs, the FBI
Yes,
file on B.F.
yes.
Skinner.
Behavioral science in the crosshairs. I'd forgotten that I had put that in there.
Very interesting. Okay, Joe, well, thank you for this. Greatly appreciated.
Of course.
Uh, Very interesting and very good lessons then. And we want to follow up with what happened to B.F. Skinner because that sounds interesting too. Uh, we'll let you enjoy the rest of that very calm looking and quiet West Virginia evening. It looks like you have there.
Yeah, Tim, anytime for you, buddy. Here's
Oh,
my
look at
West
that.
Virginia evening.
Yeah,
Anybody who
look at
cares
that.
to take a peek. Very
Yeah,
nice out there.
yeah. Okay.
So,
We'll see you in the near future,
we'll
Joe.
talk again soon. Thank you, Tim. So long.
All right. Bye-bye.